2006 Volvo S40 engine failure. We had an engine failure on this S40. Most of the time when you see these engines that have failed, it's because the timing belt is broken. Or that's what people seem to think has happened. On this car, the timing belt's off of it now, but it did not break. It jumped time, causing this engine to be damaged. I'm not sure that you can see that very well, but as you can see there, that the top of these pistons have been, the valves have hit the top of these pistons, and it's mostly the intake valve. I know you can't tell by this shot here, but this engine has bent valves. And now to get into what we think happened. On these S40s, for whatever reason, they do not put a level indicator on these reservoir tanks. Okay, so what happened in this car, the coolant level depleted. The engine overheated, causing it to jump time. And it actually burnt the oil and damaged the engine. Now, what happened, how that happened, so this car was on a long trip. Coolant level was good when it left. Alright, the engine coolant depleted, and then you're asking yourself, why was there no temperature indication of the engine overheating? Well, this car does have a temperature gauge, but I've read online where people have actually had this problem where they've lost coolant and the temperature gauge never moved. So there's really no way to know that the coolant was gone. Most of the times you're on short trips, you can see the coolant, you can see whether it's leaked out on the car, but when you're on a trip and you're making a continuous trip, then that can deplete and you not notice it. Now, what we found happened was this hose, which is called the upper hose, looks like a Christmas tree. It's been through a tornado. But you see that right here, this crack. Well, it would not leak until it got under pressure. And the hose sits like this, so the crack is over here, and there's actually another crack right here. So these cracks didn't show any sign of leaking until they got under pressure. But that's exactly where it was leaking, was there at that crack. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, why could you not see that leaking? Well, right here's why. You cannot see this hose from up here. The hose lays in there like this, okay? You've got your crack is here, and you've got another one on this, but this lays down in under all this stuff. You can't see it. And when it was leaking, it was just a tiny stream of water. When I brought the pressure up to 20 psi, you could see the water coming out underneath, but you couldn't tell where it was coming from. So at any rate, while we were on a long trip with this car, the coolant depleted, the engine overheated, sort of galled up those valves, causing the cams to stop. The crankshaft actually jumped a couple of teeth. Then when it did let go, it bent the valves and the car shut off and would build no compression because there was bent valves and the compression was going straight through the engine. So I don't know how common this is, but from what I've read on the internet, this does happen to these cars. You lose your coolant level, your temperature does not move, so you have no way of knowing that your car is overheating. This may not make sense to people. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's what happened. That is what happened. So hopefully this video will help some of you to at least check your coolant level when you're on a long trip. Every time you fill up with gas or every other time, just make sure you've got plenty of fluid in this thing, because there is no level indicator. Now I had to buy a special tool. The special tool was the adapter to go on that reservoir tank right there, to where I can put my pressure testing tool on that and build the pressure to test. That's the only way I found that leak, because you couldn't see it without taking everything off to get to it. So there may be a way. I've read where some people have retrofitted this tank to give some kind of level indication. I suppose there's some ways to do it. My thought process is to use a coolant reservoir off of a XC70. It actually has the level indicator. You would have to adapt it to fit here, but I think the hoses in the back or the underneath are the same. This has two hoses that go into the side, but I think you can adapt that to where those two hoses will go together. And then you would have to wire your connector through the power and through some sort of an idiot light inside the car that could activate when that coolant level got low. I've heard of someone else that actually took their washer reservoir level and moved it to that tank. So when you got a low washer level indication, you actually had low coolant in your engine. I guess that would work. At any rate, if you don't want to retrofit this or don't want to attempt that, then check your coolant level regularly, because it can destroy your engine. You find a lot of these cars in Craigslist where people have saying that the timing belt broke. That may be the issue. It may not be. If the timing belt breaks, obviously you're going to be in valves. If the engine overheats and to the point to where it seizes the valves, the timing belt did not break, but it jumped time. So that destroyed the engine. And it's possibly why you see these listed on Craigslist for very cheap. A lot of times you think, well, you can just replace the head and take care of that. Well, as long as your pistons are not damaged and your rings aren't binding up, you're fine. You can do that. But you have to replace all your valves in your head. So you could be looking at, $400 or $500 just to redo the head on one of these. So we replaced this engine with one out of a salvage yard, and I think we paid approximately $1,500 for that engine. This engine, the car may not be worth much more than that, or at least half. The engine was half of the value of the car. But keep in mind, this car has some sentimental value. This is my son's car, and my dad owned this car, and my dad passed away a couple years ago. So this has sentimental value to my son. So that's why we repaired this car and got it back on the road.